Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first Tuesday talks of the new year, January 2022. Kind of the same as January 2021 and March 2020. Seems that while we seem to have come a fair ways, we seem to be right back at not quite the starting point, but pretty darn close to it. And we thought, what a better time to check in on our risk management plans and everything than a time that we're at now, and you know, sort of peek in on some things that we may haven't thought about, but since it's been so long since we've run some of our events, it's some things that we should probably sharpen up on and be prepared for. So we've asked Peter Ashwin, our risk management specialist and author of our risk management module on our website, to join us. Peter, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Good, happy New Year. I wish it would have been happy for many of you, because yeah, as Dave mentioned today, that's one thing about the risk. It's dynamic and changes all the time. And unfortunately, here we go again around this. And we're going to frame a bit of the conversation about decision making and uncertainty. We'll talk about a little bit about the risk horizon, something I developed last year, actually back into 2021, and some iterations around that. And this look forward out of COVID. I think one of the things to see is, generally in our discussions, we talk about availability bias, which is everything. We only see one thing because this is so close to us. And what I'm seeing now is, we're coming out of COVID, depending which country, which state, whether it's in the US or province here in Canada. We've got to look at other things that are downstream beyond COVID as we get ready to go back into those capacities, because we've seen some incidents down in Houston, with crowd safety. So all of these things that haven't been so apparent, these risk, crowd safety risk, security risks, they extend, haven't gone away. But now, as we reinvigorate our events going forward, we need to think about some of those other things that haven't been on our radar for the best part of 2 years now.
And I guess, Peter, with your connections around the world and everything, maybe if you could shed some light on some things you're seeing worldwide. Like, we were talking earlier about the CDC putting Canada back in that dangerous travel zones for the American. And, I'm watching the American national football game with 85,000 people in the stands, and yet it's dangerous to come to Canada. And the numbers down there are just skyrocketing. So what are you seeing, hearing from all the different contacts you have?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. For those who don't know my background, I'm actually a global citizen. So resident here in Montreal, US citizen, and obviously an Australian, with some really good contacts back in the UK. Yeah, it's, looking on with my colleagues on the other side of the border, the southern border, and it's very interesting, their perspective, how they're dealing with it. We just see the transmission rates of Omicron is just like extremely high. But we see Texas came back very early, had their view was 100% capacity. And we'll talk about some of the downstream risks when you go from 0 to 100% again. What does that mean? Some of the other states are a little bit more cautious, similar to up here in Canada, before we step back one step, the 50% and all those other aspects of the health and safety. And I think by and large, a lot of the protocols that events are doing now are good, managing both the security and safety events in this current environment. Now, across in the UK, it's the same. UK, Europe, some good friends and colleagues over there, they're being restricted now. And I think we'll talk a little bit more later on about, they face, the same organizational risk that we do. It's this loss of industry talent. And I think there's two aspects of the talent that we're seeing in Exodus. Next generational leaders who don't see a career path forward right now, the young guns, the young Turks out there who have left our industry and changed career paths for now and may not come back. And then, have the old dogs, as call them, at the top end with all the experience in our industry, and a lot of them, deciding now it's bad enough and it's time to leave. So that's something that concerns me greatly about, is when we go back, we can't assume that we've got the same operational edge that we did 2 years ago. What are we going to do about that? And we'll talk a bit more as during these talks around that, because that's, for me, is a key focus now, is individual team resilience and preparedness, getting ready for your events whenever that may be, which is hopefully coming out of this in the spring, in the summer, in the fall. Again,
and Peter, as you've been watching carefully, as all of us have, of what's been going on, would you say that there's a model country or somebody that you think is really doing it right, and that we should be looking there for guidance, or are we doing it right? In your opinion, is the province of Ontario got the right method of dealing with this?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dave. There's like the risk adversity or risk appetite of certain, public safety authorities or public health authorities around that. And certainly, I think, here in Canada and province of, whether it's here in Quebec or in Ontario, is quite risk averse in that way. What I do is that I think is quite helpful is Australia and UK or Europe tend to be a step ahead of both on here and us in North America, and New Zealand's another good example as well. How they've contained the COVID and then got back into the events, but also shut down again. So Auckland shut down and locked down after a couple of days. So that gives us a bit of an indicator of what's going on elsewhere. It doesn't mean our government or provincial authorities or health authorities will take the same steps, but I'm sure they look elsewhere around that. UK, got some really good colleagues there, and they've been doing some testing. We're also seeing something else that's quite unusual. Is some of the guest and spectator and fan behaviour is very different from what we saw pre-COVID. Astro World example, storming through security there. Wembley Stadium, what occurred during there in November, in 2020. The reports just come out about that, and they recently had at the O2 Stadium too. O2 Arena is similar as the young people trying to rush through security. So things have changed in that regard. So it's a good idea is for all of us to keep doing an environmental or a sort of horizon scan of what's happening outside our own world, give us some indicators and context for what it's going to be like here in Canada, here in Ontario, here in Quebec as we get through the next couple of months or hopefully the weeks ahead.
And Peter, you've provided us throughout the course of COVID with some good resiliency plans and sort of charts and updates. And I'm just wondering if you can update your latest one for us all and just sort of walk us through.
Yeah, we'll get. Hey Jay, can you pull that slide up for me, please? Just get Jay. Pull that up. Here we go. Will come up. So this is something I developed, Dave. I think we've seen it a couple of times, and hopefully many of the audience have, who's on the call today, is something I developed back in 2020, quite early on. Because one of the things, for us as event professionals, we're really good at doing. I talk about heuristics. We got this toolkit of all these things we've done, this institutional experience, and we're really good at making planning and making decisions on the fly. That's what we do. But it changed and it became problematic is how to make decisions under uncertainty. And VUCA, and Volatile, Ambiguous, Complex, and Uncertain Environment came out of post-Cold War. It's a military term, but it really just goes, and it's in management theory now, but it really describes our environment over the last 2 years. And part of this was, making sort of from a business resilience, we see those phases down below. And by the way, we're going to share this afterwards. And it seems that, we're doing this pivot around reset, restart, and recovery. We're getting into recovery, going back from events, then it changes the transmission rates. And so the things, Dave and I, we had a chat early on last week about is like, what can we control in this environment, which is very uncertain? There's some things we can control. We have to change our planning processes a little bit about decision points and having a better awareness, which most of you now know is go, no go criteria. What is our cost benefit analysis of capacities, and, is the event going to be profitable? Is it 50%, 65% capacity break even? And, what's our financial resilience if we don't meet that? So understanding, setting yourself some intervals or thresholds of upper and lower bounds around that. And that will help you and your boards make some decisions around that.
And Peter, as we were talking earlier, a lot of people don't do that cost benefit analysis. And,
right.
And I think it's a good exercise at any time just to sort of review what, if you do have a paying ticket, are you covering all your hard costs with that ticket? And or are you selling yourself short and you're already starting out playing catch up? So, while we haven't run full up events for a couple of years now, it's a good chance to say when we get back and we start, is this one worth doing and putting our what might be now limited resources behind, or should we put it behind the event C, which is much more profitable, and with limited resources, that's the way we should go.
It's a really tough decision, I feel, for you guys out there. Ultimately, is like you want to get back into there, but it's like, what is the risk? The risk about the opportunities getting back and having a successful event versus not, and just then being able to weigh those two things up and saying, can we afford at the bottom end of the interval threshold this loss? Particularly, I used to say to colleagues, pre-COVID is about, if you have a really bad year, this is about, can you survive in a year two? That's right. And now we're going into year three. What does that mean? What is your financial resilience about that? So, it's making a decision. Do I do something in early spring, depending on the scheduling event and environment, or do you push it later? And that's that hard decision. And I think what helps is around that is critical decision points and knowing long lead items, or when you got to put deposits down, when, how long does it take to plan an event for, how to ramp it up? Is it 6 months, is it 3 months, or is it 8 weeks? What does the supply chain look like in the background? All your suppliers, are they still in existence, and will they have the same capacity to be able to support the event? And these will help shape those decisions, which goes back into, this, what I call the critical success indicators, or another term we use is key risk indicators, is transmission rates high right now, and that's stopped the events. What is the local public health authorities? What's their view? And I think talking to them as often as you can, as I know Dave's well tapped in the provincial level, but down the local level, what influences them? What's their risk appetite like? And what are your consumers like back out there? And I think if you're in the millennials, you're probably, I'm good to go. But what I may get or may not get, it's not a problem. But probably those of us who were, the Gen X types, probably go, I don't know about that. So am I ready to go back to mass events right now? Do I really want to fly and do those other things? And then most importantly is look at your supply chain. And that's really going to determine whether you can put your event on. As much as we have this huge desire to get out there and do these things for our communities, but can you actually sustainably deliver it? What is the people part of it? You're telling your seasonal contractors, your staff, staging and lighting, if you're doing outdoor festivals and stuff like that, porta potty security, can you get the stuff that you need? And then of course we all want to do the same thing in the same time frame. And with the city's got limited resources, city services are being impacted by all of this. So it's and I always being the harbinger of grim news. I'm sorry, but I try to be a bit more cheery about some of this stuff.
Well, I think the other important thing too is as we're looked at and faced with cancellation or postponing or looking at different times, that environmental scan of what's happening around you as well. Like, you don't want to be moving into another busy season with something else taking up or cutting into their territory. So that environmental scan is important. But you and I hit on some, and I never really thought of it, but it makes a lot of sense, is that I thought getting back into the events and stuff, getting a good volunteer base and getting them back up to speed and running. But you made a good point the other day, and it was that it's not just getting your volunteer base up and running. It's some of your A players who have been out of the game now for 2 years, and what used to come naturally, or, every year it's the same type of thing. And we've now been out of that pace for 2 years for a lot of us. And even some people that were able to pull off smaller scale event or virtual events, ramping up to that large scale event, it takes time and talent and takes some muscles that a lot of us haven't used for a few years. Can you speak?
Absolutely, Dave. Yeah, I think that for me is that preparedness and the readiness aspect is, absolutely fundamental where we need to be next. And understanding that is by risk associated, not spending some time in that. And this, we saw, without going into Astro World, I'm not going to talk about that, that tragedy down there. But what came out of that is, if you look at the private security industry, they they suffer the same as we have in this decay of skills and experience. And, that's how we get OJT, on-job experience, by doing what we do best and learning from it. But if that doesn't exist anymore, the first event you're going to go back to is it's going to be a learning experience. So we need to think about front-ending. What are we doing to help prepare our people for that? Going through tabletop exercises or discussion exercises, making sure we talk through plans, we do walkthroughs on the site. So we need to factor in a little bit more time. And there's a cost with that, from a resourcing cost and also time cost, making sure that, we're talking about some of these things, particularly, evacuations. Generally, they're very poorly done. Unless the industry's changed in the last 2 years since they did the survey, 40% didn't even have an evacuation plan. So, understanding those, making sure for the larger scale events, crowd safety, how we move people, how they get in and out of venues, are we ready? Who knows the plan? And revisit the plan. What's changed? Because everything's changed. That's the thing about it. I think that's really important. And the other thing too is building confidence in your team. There's one thing about being competent, so we've got to spend some time training, and then making sure they're confident in what they're doing, that individual and team resilience aspect, that getting them ready. So, okay, we're good to go. And we've thought about all these things that may have gone wrong previously, but think about them now as, are we ready to manage all these potentially adverse events as well? And that's just a core fundamental from leadership and management and getting teams ready. And let's think about it. So one of our attendees, he's got a military uniform, being an ex-military guy. It's all about that. Is you go from, we used to call it MLOC, minimum level capability, to OLOC, operational. You just don't do that jump, go to combat operations from training at home to that. And we need to think of that spectrum, as an event organizers, event professionals and leaders. How do we do that jump from this, we've been in hibernation for 2 years and now we're going to get ready for these events, and what steps we need to take around that?
Well, and Peter, we talked a little bit earlier about you and I, about the Olympics coming up, and we talked about the World Juniors. And, I remember watching Team Canada's second game in Edmonton, and the announcers, and I think they were talking to one of the leaders at the IHF, and, they said, oh, we've got everybody into the bubble and we should be safe. We should be able to continue this tournament, because everything was sort of collapsing around them. And not 12 hours later, they up and canceled the tournament. So how do you plan and build something like that into your plans? We know we're ready to cancel or postpone, but something that's happening, a multi-day event that, you're 2 days in and all of a sudden you're canceling.
Yeah, that's really tough, isn't it? I think that's another great question, is like, how do we manage and plan for that? And it goes back to risk is dynamic and changes, and this likelihood thing. So if we, the key risk facing you as the teams out there now is, postponement or cancellation, late notice cancellation of your event after you've spent this money and time and getting ready to go for it. And this is understanding, firstly, go back to your resilience about that, your financial resilience. And particularly now, if we can't offset it, now in the past, we have offset it through event cancellation insurance. I'm not quite sure of what that landscape looks like now, Dave. You might have some more insight on that. But if you don't have that to hedge against, then what does it mean? It goes back to recircling back to cost benefit analysis. Can we do this at worst case? If this happens, what does that mean? If it's cancelled the day before, what is our refund policy for tickets and all those sort of things? How do we manage those aspects? And I think, Dave, just thinking about what could trigger it, postponement, transmission rates of COVID, city officials generally won't tell you to cancel the event. They don't accept that liability. But, it comes back to, can you actually do it in a way that doesn't, expose you to public safety or public health risk around that? So in sum for that is just think about those scenarios and talk about them as a team, and think about time and space about that, and particularly around the temporal aspect, the time aspect. When you have to make decisions, what would this mean? If this happened now, can I still do this, or does this change how I'm going to approach the problem around that? It sounds like don't have any solutions out there. It's more about how do we think through problems? This planning on an uncertainty around that and trying to work out, I guess, what do you know and what do you don't know, the knowns and the assumptions, and make some assumptions, then keep working towards those assumptions. Assumption is we're going to get 50%, minimum of 50% capacity. Best case, it might be 75. And what does that mean? Keep planning until they become apparent, or the decision points in time. Make sure you have to say go, no go, or we go further around that.
So, Peter, if you were checking in on a risk and resiliency plan right now, what would some of your top 5 things to check in on be? I mean, that's one of the mistakes we all make as well, that, a risk management plan is made once and sort of tucked away. And, if and ever we need that, we'll go back to that file and check it. But really, it should be a living, breathing document that changes and is updated as things are happening. Like, this is a great time to be updating a risk management plan, but your updates might be bigger than your plan was to start with. So where would you start?
It's a great question. The first thing I'd say is, if you have a plan, that's great. If you have a risk register, that's super. I'd be really impressed by that. And hopefully, for our courses, it's encouraging people to actually document what their risks are. And if you look at on the screen now, those bottom 5, it's still a pretty extent from where we are around that. To think about cancellation events, supply chain, we can't get talent, and how do we manage those sort of things? And then I think for me is one of the things that, I'm writing my master's dissertation on risk management and lone actor threats at the moment to events. And part of that is delving back into how we as an industry do risk management or understand risk. And I think a lot of it's pretty qualitative, subjective how we do it. And quite often we don't write this process down. And also as understanding what works, what manages risk the best way. And if we talk about risk as a two-dimensional aspect of likelihood and consequence. And likelihood will change, as we know at the moment with COVID. It's changing daily, weekly around the transmission rates, which changes the risk of cancellation, postponement around that. So understanding, number one, write down what you think the risks are, and the way to do that is think about all the things that have occurred in the past. When I say yesterday's incident is tomorrow's risk, make sure we capture those sort of things. Thinks what's occurred in your slips, trips, and falls. That's something we need to manage in a way. That's one of that and golf cart accidents are number 1 or number 2, depending on any day or any event that the 2 top insurance clients around that. So we need to manage that. So things that we need to manage, and also go back to on the security side, these things haven't gone away. The lone actors, I don't talk about lone wolves. I think it's about lone actors, some with ideological motives, those with personal grievances, they haven't gone away as well. We just need to be aware about those things and what things we can do to put in place that help deter some of those things from having some really good practices that I'm researching now. Think about things, I think too, Dave, is if we can't prevent something from happening, what can we do to manage the consequences and reduce the severity of harm? And some really good things around that. And this is what we spoke about now is team preparedness, those drills and exercises, making sure you have good integrated communications with your public safety and law enforcement agencies, or your local provincial police services around how we're going to do that. Evacuation plans, make sure you have an evacuation plan. Make sure you've actually trained people on an evacuation plan. I'll give you a good example. As a couple of years ago, I was down in Memphis in May for the international festival for the World Championship Barbecue Cook-Off contest. And in May, they typically have these storm cells that will roll through down the Mississippi River. And there's ground strikes within the threshold, so they decided to evacuate. And really good decision from the incident management team, the festival team, and the director of operations. And communication was good. Where it failed was, I shouldn't say it didn't fail, but where it wasn't successful, it was the security guard who's on the gates. When people ask him, where do we go to shelter in place? I don't know. How are people going to communicate to me? So that's really important, is to think about when we're doing our plans for the future, while we've got this thing, don't forget about your line staff, those people who are on the gates, who are the team leaders who will actually make a difference between, particularly during a critical incident, life safety. They're the ones going to manage it. And the other thing I say now to everyone, particularly if you're in the private security industry, you're not training people on stop and bleed, you're negligent, in my view, because that is just a core function that we understand from these mass casual incidents that occur. Is the people who save lives and stop people bleeding out is our staff, our volunteers, our security, our team leaders, those on the ground before, the enough IMTs and all those other things get triggered around that. So we need to focus on some of those aspects as well.
And Peter, the one thing, and I think it's becoming abundantly clear through the outbreak is, and it's no different with any other plan or risk management thing that we have, is that communication plan that goes with it is so important. And I think that's where the government is losing us a bit on some of the communication. I think they're doing a lot of good things, but their communication hasn't been the greatest on a lot of issues, and has sort of spun the bottle, and you're not sure where it's stopping, or what's been repeated, or what's been promised but not allocated. So that communication plan that goes with it, to your point about talking to your security guards and stuff, is of utmost importance as well.
Yeah, it's across all thresholds, and I think go back to that one particular comment is what I've seen is a lot of these tabletop exercises, we do them at a management level or with the police and fire and EMS, but it goes back to understanding what some of the risks are and talking to your volunteer team leaders. And just I think this whole scenario based, because this is how we learn, experiential learning as adults, and talk people through scenarios. What would you do if this happened? And those sort of things, it's an easy win. It's like 10 or 15 minutes help, but you need a little bit of training, coaching with your junior leaders and staff, your line management. And it's like, okay, start of each brief, why don't you go through these 5 things? These are the 5 top things, 5 top risks for our festival. And this is how we translate risks down to that level. Okay, what are we going to do if this happens? Evacuation. Make sure you talk your team through how this may be triggered, how we do that. If there's an incident, how do we report it? If it's a critical incident, what do you need to do around that? If we capture some of that. And also too is like, if you see something that doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right, then how do you report it? Make sure we're reporting those sort of things, because there's indicators out there, and all of us know, I've got experience, is like, we'll look at it either something that's occurring in activity going, that's not going very well, or that person that she does not fit into this picture. We need to find out about that. And that's training our staff as, they call it on the southern border here in Department of Homeland Security is the power of hello now. It's like, this confrontation is uncomfortable for a lot of us, for a lot of our team. But if you say, hey, hi, how's it going there? Do you need some assistance with wayfinding? You look a little bit lost. Is anything information you're looking for? And then how they respond to that is going, that didn't feel right. And that's really about that security aspect. We can help deter those who mean to do harm, whether it's lone actor terrorists, people with grievances, or other actors around that. The number one thing they hate is being recognized, and their perception of risk skyrockets, which may be enough than saying, well, I don't think I'm going to do. No, this is not my day for this event around that.
So we're starting to see a few questions come in, Peter, and the first 2 are basically around, your front gate security, and whether you think the government is going to update or mandate, a certain standardization of health and security that maybe we didn't have before. I think it's pretty safe to say on the health and cleanliness measures, I think we're definitely going to see a step up. And on your front gate security, I guess it all depends on, what some of the new framework is around coming into event. Like, are we going to be expected to check for whether a person is double or triple vaxxed, throughout the pandemic, or will they come to a stage where that no longer has to be addressed? But I think in the interim, I think that additional security and the health measures are for certain going to be front and center.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I might do is I'll get in contact with a colleague of mine in the UK. They've been doing some testing around these protocols and how they're doing it, and they've been going quite well. He's done some work with Wembley and some other large-scale stadiums around there, and some art houses as well. So Yeah, I think, here in Quebec right now, I'm not sure in Ontario, we've got our Vax passport, and I think that's going to stay for, I would think as a requirement for the immediate future, certainly for this year. And so that's another person that needs to do those sort of things. And who does that job? And, what do you do with non-compliant guests? And I think that's one of the key risks now to manage is what do you do with non-compliant and how do you escalate that? How do you train the team on that? Because it goes back to we're seeing some behavior. People are getting tired. I get all that. Everyone wants, is tired of COVID, tired of this, tired of that, and tired of restrictions, but it doesn't mean they need to project that onto our volunteers and our staff. So we need to have some good protocols around that. How do you manage those? And I think going back to getting ready to go into events is, talking through those scenarios and how you're going to manage them around that. So there's that. I think generally there's some really good health and safety protocols, how people do things now. And I don't really have much to add on this. I'm far more technically competent people and operationally competent in this area who do it all the time around that. But there's plenty.
Yeah,
of
and anybody
resources.
that's looking for some of those standards that the province has released and put out, we've got them all captured on our COVID library on our site, and they're all time stamped and everything. So, if you're not sure what some of the different mandates are, or some of the different phases, or what you have to do for health and wellness, all that stuff is on our site. Just takes a little bit of searching. So, thanks to Jay.
What I would say is look at. So coming out of the UK is Martin's Law now from the Manchester Arena, or Protect Duty, which becomes they're releasing some guidelines on terrorism, threat, vulnerability, risk assessments coming up for responsibility from a legislation point of view for venue operators and venue and event organisers. So that's something to keep an eye on. It's I think there's other security professionals and on the government side of tracking what's happening in the UK and how that may translate here to North America and Canada around that. And this goes back to is, what is an appropriate, level of security we put in for events, and how do we balance those two things? And that's one of the most difficult things when you've got a limited budget. You don't really know what some of the threats are. And as much as people say that we know they're existing out there, but whether they'll interject with your event as a question. So that's one of the areas I'm researching into now is, what are these known evidence-based practices, and saying similar things as what talking about is training staff behavior detection, saying if out front is security, are they trained and say, ask those questions around, what are you doing here? How's your day going? Welcome to the event, and how they react. So we need to work on some of those things. Also, going back to private security thing, part of it now is making sure that, what is their level of training and where are they at now with your suppliers around that? And it's a challenge. They're becoming more expensive, and we don't have the budget for it. So how do we balance those two things, our duty of care for safety and security, and creating this event around that?
And Peter, we also talked, and you've hit on it a few times, but our key staff being 2 years removed, but our suppliers, I think, is going to be some of the bigger issues. Is are they still there? And not only our suppliers, but our sponsors. And a lot of local festivals depend on the mom and pop shops, the restaurants that kick in $1,000, a couple $1,000 here and there, and they've been through this with us as well. So I mean, that's got to be a big risk factor as well. And how would you check in on that stuff? What would your recommendation be to our members, like to call up suppliers to keep that conversation open? Or
absolutely. I think it's just keep building your relationships and going back to them, saying, how are you doing? From that personal feeling, call and check in on them as well. In this day and age, we don't quite often pick up the phone as often as we should, and I think that's something to do, is go back to those suppliers and how they're doing. The other thing we touched on too is, Dave, is now some of the calendars are going to get more crowded, and we don't have the staff, we don't have the volunteers. And I think it's more that very cooperative arrangement about how can we work together as an event community within your community, not to, step over each other. And one of those things is, can you do some, by offsetting some of the timings of events until we get enough people back on our experience, we leverage off each other's experience and teams to help each other out in this coming times, because they're going to be, I think, pretty trying. when we start reaching down and trying to find staff to run our events again around that?
We've had a few questions around insurance, and we're trying to put together an insurance panel for our virtual conference. As a lot of you have seen, unfortunately, we thought we'd be able to go live in Niagara Falls. And matter of fact, we were down there 3 times planning things out. And, just before the break, things really took a turn, and we've had to go virtual. So some of the insurance questions, we will certainly have an insurance panel and hope to get to some of those questions there. I can't speak to it off the top of my head because some of that stuff has been changing at each different stage. So I'd rather get it right from the source. Peter, do you have anything you might be able to add into that?
No, I'm not like you, probably not as up to date on that.
It's one of the files we've been working on closely with Tyler. A lot of the restaurant groups and different resorts and attractions are running into the same issue. So, we've been working at from the advocacy point of view, with the MPPs and everybody around the file. So keep posted. We will have something coming up during the virtual conference, isolating on insurance and the effect it has on our industry. So Peter, what about those that have been with festivals for a lot and sharpening up? What are some good exercises to do that and to get you back on your game? And
there's a couple of things, and go back to I think historically go back, if you do, hopefully you do keep incident reports and near misses, look at what's happened in the past as at least a baseline to start from. What's happened in the past, let's revisit those. And then don't forget about those, so we capture some historical data and then think about what's occurring now. So we capture some of that. So there's a couple of really good things. The value of preparedness is operational readiness, and getting sharp again is these scenario-based discussions. Based on risk, talk about the what ifs. What do we do if this happens? How are we going to manage it? And at what time does it happen? And think about too, go back to risk is spatial and temporal. Over time and space, it changes. So think about just not on the event day, but leading up to it. All these things that can happen. We don't meet. What happens if we don't meet ticket sales? Projected ticket sales by this date. What are we doing around that? So think organizationally wide as well, just not from a safety and security or COVID aspect. So they're good every time. Like one thing about coming out of COVID is Zoom and other video conferencing. So all those times we said we can never find enough time, and we're starting to build out. This has now allowed us an opportunity with teams that don't live and reside in the same location for an event, is actually do things ahead of time and schedule a call to talk about these sort of things. This is the plan, go through plans, take those opportunities. So that's something we can really leverage off. One of the key lessons we shouldn't lose sight of coming out of COVID, that technology can help us gain more time and become more familiar with documentations and getting ready for that. There's the discussion-based exercises, going through those. The other one I like is when you get on site is do communication exercises, ComExes or drills. So one of the key things is making sure from an assurance level and duty care, making sure, we can talk to who we need to talk to, and practice that drill. A lot of these things, they take they take a little bit of planning, about 15, 20 minutes or 30 minutes to actually execute, and then do hot wash up afterwards. It's like, go through that drill, talk about a drill about evacuation or an active shooter, the key risks, or there's a fire, and saying, do those on the radio and see how that works for you pre-event before your gates opening around that. And regardless of, the size, if you've got comms, how do you do it? Whether it's you're doing WhatsApp group messages or if you don't have radios, but you need to test those sort of things. So that's that communications piece. The other thing is, I think is important out of that is making sure we get better doing, debriefs. I was talking to Veronica and her team, they talk about the Canadian Olympic Committee about debrief after the games, and they don't do as good job about that. As look about, we call them the military hot wash-ups, is like, what are the key things? What do we learn from this? Then what are we going to do about it? And who owns those things to going forward? And I think that's like risk, you got to have risk owners. If, from a project management point of view, if you don't assign the task to someone to manage in a timeline, it will never get done. And that's clear. And sometimes I think as event professionals, we lose sight of that aspect of it. And we come back, oh yeah, that's right, we spoke about that last year or last event. Oh yeah, we forgot about that. So let's not lose sight of things we've learned. Make sure they become part of our culture, our learning culture around that. Then I think too is the importance of the other aspect you can do is walkthroughs too. I find a lot of value, particularly now with new teams. And don't forget this changeover in police and fire and all those. They probably have new special event representatives, liaisons who have changed from 2 years ago. And it's like doing a site walkthrough together where they're going to stage vehicles. What would we do here and who's there and who's responsible for the spaces around that? So they're kind of sort of the normal sequence of things that low cost, not time intensive or resource intensive, but you get a lot of bang for your buck. And it also, more importantly, is it's reducing your exposure to liability, because as one of these dreaded expert witnesses, I see a lot of things that people just don't do like that. And saying, we wrote our plans down, we talked through our plans, we did them on site, we had a walkthrough, we tested our communications. And if you're doing that, you're pretty resilient from a liability point of view, and you're doing the right thing and fulfilling your duty of care. So that's, I think,
Peter, Rob brings up a good question and a good point for all of us, and where it really fits into the risk envelope is the cyber risk that we're all subjected to. That it's always been cyber attack has always been something, whether it's your ticketing system or whatever. But now that we're doing more Zoom meetings or virtual events, online ticketing, and in some cases a cashless event where everything's run through a bracelet or whatever. What are those cyber risks that we need to really prepare for as well?
It's a really good question from Rob. One of the papers I wrote in 2020 was on cyber criminals and events around this, and I think looking at our exposure about that, where these key, goes back to success event. A lot of our we rely on successes. Ticketing providers are third party. How resilient are their cyber protocols? And then, there's an expectation from a guest experience for most events now have some sort of, well, depending on the size of the event, about Wi-Fi coverage. What does it mean if you lose that? You lose your network at your event, or what is your resilience around? Can you do things on over 5G, 3G, 4G around that? And I think a lot of it is about training. It's just awareness training. Goes back to this continual training around do not click on these sort of things. It's the ransomware aspect of it, losing your data. What resiliency have you got, redundancy about your data at any point in time? If it's locked up, is it backed up somewhere? Is it 30 days old? You're going to lose 30 days worth. So around that. For those, I think a while ago, I showed one of those infographics I did, Dave. So I'll send it back to Jay about cyber for events, stay in the music, don't get lost in the cloud, about just some basic principles around that. Not being a cyber guy, there's some very good technical people. I look at it from an operational aspect about that. And I think that's a really good important point is go back to this happens as a risk. And the risk is not cyber security per se or a cyber attack. That's just the trigger for it. The risk is really the loss of data, inability to access data, or inability to disruption to your IT network. So how you frame the risk is really important. And then understanding is what is your tolerance around outages. If you lose it for a day or 2 days, if you're 6 months out from the event or 3 months out, then maybe that's okay. But if you're coming into your event, what does that mean? And that will give you some guidance around what controls you need to be put in place for that redundancy. If it happens, invariably of all, is what's your resilience or the consequence management at the back end. That's important.
And we've had a question from Lori about outdoor events and refill stations for water. And I would say stuff like that, we're just going to have to keep our eye out. I think any touch points right now are, the more touch points you can eliminate, the better off you are. But, I think that will be in some standards and practices. And that might vary as well from municipality to municipality. And that's one of the things we have to remember is the different tiers and level of government. Like the Ontario Minister of Health can say one thing, but the 13 regional health units can, if the province loosens something up, the municipalities can still keep it tight if they want. They can't go over and above the ministry, but they can certainly tighten rules and change rules as it comes to. So it's important to touch with all bases of government throughout this as well.
I just want to go back to Rob's question at the back end about the mitigation. I think one of the important parts of it is whatever you put in place, it needs to be practical. Because what happens is, some really good studies done on this, people work around it. If it's inconvenience, impacting my work practices, it's not like they don't agree that, cybersecurity practices are important, but it's too inconvenient, it won't happen. And when you think you got things in place, then you're actually carrying a lot more risk about that. It's thinking about putting things that are practical, that are effective in place, and making sure staff actually do it. And which goes back to all of that risk management is now trust but verify. Is like we trust our staff and make sure all these things you're putting in place, these controls, policies, procedures, training, engineering, hazard reduction, are they being done? What is your level of confidence being done and who's doing them? Because that's what happens. It's inevitably when incidents occur, it's not because you don't have controls in place, they're ineffective.
Any other questions from anybody out there? So Peter, we've got about 14 minutes until the top of the hour when we usually wrap it up. Any final words that you want to leave with our people to as we head in this ever-changing world and keep this front and center right now?
Well, I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, so that is good. And then
a train.
Yeah, that's another train coming from the other direction. And people like me is like supporting our industry, is out there helping you, because you're so important to our communities. And these events coming back is going to be more important than any other time. I think the last recent history about our communities really need these gatherings to occur in the near future. So keep what you're doing, keep up the good fight, and we'll do as much as we can around that, help you at least come to those decisions. Whatever we can do is think about that planning from that and understanding where those pain points are, how you can progress, and then critical decision points around that. And then understanding your parameters left and right, and your teams, rebuilding your teams. I think that's the number one message I believe now is, what are you going to do to rebuild your team, get ready for the event, and how are you going to do that? And your team is that broader, including your suppliers as well, and your volunteers and your representatives from the city or municipality.
And your risk management plan is really as good as you make it, and it's like an insurance policy, right? You don't realize how good it is until you have to rely on it, and
right,
that's
right.
important to practicing it and touching it a couple times a year.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm rewriting some of that stuff now, which I'll share with Dave and the FEO in the coming weeks. What is important is you'll hear, I have attorneys tell me, well, it increases the liability if you have the plan, you don't actually put it in place. Well, that's not a defendable argument as well. I appreciate some of these things will take time, but more you think about things. And for me is, if we do it really simply, this is, I'll talk about this exercise. It's called risk ranking or risk filtering. And it's been around for quite some, a couple of decades. So you as a team come up with your list of risks, get in a room and write down on a board. That would be the first thing. And you might come up with a manageable list of 15 to 20. I wouldn't do any more than that, that you're concerned about or have, a significant impact on your event. Then go away individually and rank them from 1 to 20 and score them. So your number one risk would be 20, or say you have 15 risks, number one is a value of 15 and your lowest risk is 1. And then you come back as a team and aggregate those results. And that gives you then a scored, be it subjectively, a scoring of what you think your risks are across within your broader team. Then all you need to think about is, what am I doing to prevent it? And what am I going to do to reduce the consequences if it occurs? And write those things down. These are your controls. And then who's actually responsible for those, and when was the last time we checked they're effective? And if you're doing those things, that's as simple as it can get, without even thinking about the likelihood, whether it's going to happen or not happen. But if you think about those things, then you're actually starting to manage your risk. And I think that's, to me, is one of the key things is how can we, for our industry is, time, experience, and resources, problematic. How do we make it as simple as possible, but as robust, that provides the resilience you require as an event organizer, both to making sure we put on safe and secure events, and also to protect you when liability comes knocking at the door.
Well, Peter, we thank you very much for this and everything you do for all of us at FEO. Anybody that wants to take a deeper dive, our module series is on our website, and I know Peter's happy to help in and along that if you're doing stuff in teams and little tech talks before or afterwards. So anybody that's interested in any of that, just please make sure to get in touch with us. Again, Peter, from all of us, thank you very much for joining us today and imparting some of this great information. Just want to remind everybody that Kyle is up next week with his, he's hosting our Supply and Demand with Rafflebox and TipTap, both fundraising technologies that might be useful to some of your events. So until next week, everybody stay safe. Hopefully we'll start to see some changes coming soon, and everybody keep well. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks again, Peter.
Thanks, Dave. Be well and keep up the good fight, team.